Saya No Uta holds a very special place in my heart. I did like it, but it's not my favorite visual novel, and it's not even one of my go-to recommendations. But as a fan of HP Lovecraft, I very much respect the clear homage that goes far deeper than just the obvious. But Saya No Uta is also the subject of a video I made that is, in my opinion, some of the best work I've ever done on this platform. Safe to say, Saya No Uta is a visual novel that resonates with me. Now, if you're tuned into the visual novel community, you may be aware that my buddy Ange, who goes by SuperAnge128 here on YouTube, does not feel the same way, and he recently made a video expressing as much. And yeah, while he did have some supporters here, the man kinda got cooked. Now look, I am not bothered that he's got a bit of a hot take I disagree with. I get it. I make enemies every time I mention how much I hate Mafia too. But after watching Ange's video, I had some serious points of contention with the arguments he made. I'm not one to jump on the bandwagon and pile on an unpopular opinion. Instead, I'd rather frame this more as a discussion, because I think there are interesting things to talk about here. And also, I do like Ange. He's a good dude. Please be nice to him. Doesn't stop him from being wrong, though. I'll link Ange's video in the description. I do recommend watching it so you can be sure I'm not misrepresenting him. It's only 8 minutes long. If you watch my long-ass videos, you can handle that. I'll also link the video I did on Saya No Uta a while back if you want a deeper look at the interesting literary stuff it did that I love so much. And there will be spoilers in both Ange's video and this one, so do be aware of that. Ange conveniently splits his arguments into 5 main sections. Let's tackle them one by one, shall we? His first point is pretty short, so I'll let it play out in its entirety.
Reason 1. The lack of emotional investment in the story. The fact that due to the short nature of it, we barely have time to get emotionally invested in Fuminori's situation. The visual novel does give you some snippets of what his life was like before his accident and his thoughts on what he went through after, but to me, this wasn't enough. I know people hate slice of life in story-heavy visual novels, but I think at least a few hours of getting to see how likable Fuminori supposedly was and his relationship with his friends would have made his tragedy a lot more interesting and worth investing into.
Okay, so if you know Ange, you know he's a big slice of life and moege fan. I am too, to be fair. But I think that extensive character work from before Fuminori's accident would not only be unnecessary, but would actually detract from the work as a whole. Now, I will agree that I think Saya No Uta is a little bit too short. It's structured kinda like a flight of stairs, with each step in the story shifting the overall tone into more and more of a shit's fucked kind of vibe, and I do wish it slowed the pace down a bit and lingered more on each individual step, because there was just a lot that I would have liked to see explored a bit more. But where I disagree is that I don't think any of the before times matter at all. The tragedy of Saya No Uta is not about Fuminori losing his human connections. In fact, by the time the story properly begins, Fuminori's family is dead. His relationship with his friends is severely frayed due to his involuntary, visceral reactions to how he perceives them following his accident. He already hates them. We're not supposed to get emotionally invested in that loss because it already happened. See, one of the driving themes of Saya No Uta is how Fuminori continually rejects his original sense of morality, isolates himself from the rest of the world in favor of a toxic codependent relationship with Saya, and becomes more and more irrational as time goes on. The point of Fuminori's friends is on the one hand to show how Fuminori has already started on the process of isolation from the start, and also to serve as visceral demonstrations of his deteriorating mental state. I don't feel like a deeper look at this friendship would make that theme any stronger than it already is, and I would argue that an extended period of normalcy would kind of kill the pacing of the story. This story is basically a loop of Fuminori breaks a taboo, Fuminori goes more insane. I feel like breaking that structure wouldn't actually accomplish anything meaningful. I feel like Saya No Uta was going for a very specific type of story, and Ange was essentially disappointed that it wasn't a different type of story that he tends to prefer. The next section is about Saya's true form. He kinda makes 3 smaller points, so let's break those up a bit. I won't be playing every single word, but the gist of his arguments will be here.
However, the way Saya No Uta executed this visual POV twist for Saya was stupid to me. I know this is a Japanese-created visual novel, and they love their convenient anime waifus, but first of all, is Fuminori's ideal waifu some random lolly? Really?
Okay, so admittedly, this is not a major sticking point in Ange's video. It was really more of an offhand kind of thing than anything serious. But I do think that this relatively minor complaint highlights something important about Saya No Uta. See, the visual novel seriously leans into the idea of juxtaposing Fuminori's perspective and reality. As I explained in my Saya No Uta video from back in the day, Fuminori essentially had his emotional perception of the things around him flipped. His surroundings went from normal and comforting to scary and horrible. His friends went from a source of happiness to a source of hatred. Food went from tasty to gross. Saya in reality is pretty much the definition of horrifying and imposing. I don't think the form we see through Fuminori's eyes is meant to be his sexy waifu. It's meant to depict the opposite of the stereotypical eldritch horror. The opposite of that is not hot and sexy, it's purity and innocence. That's why he sees Saya as a cute little girl. The fact that he starts fucking her is actually one of the earlier signs of his fraying mental state, and I'm pretty sure it's the first taboo he breaks in the story. So while this is a minor complaint by Ange, I do think it shows that he kind of missed the big idea that this visual novel was trying to put forth. The next point is about the mechanics of sex with Saya, and it is notable because he goes back to this point several times. Take it away, Ange.
It just doesn't make sense with him in regards to having sex with Saya. I refuse to believe that the monster that Saya, or whatever that weird eldritch BS she is, can just somehow create an equivalent of a human vagina that pleasures her somehow, and that any human that can see her can somehow take advantage of that.
Okay, I'm not going to talk at length about this one, but I do think that Ange might not have included this point if he really stopped to think about it. I have two issues. Firstly, I think it is entirely logical that Saya feels pleasure when fucking Fuminori. Her biology is centered around acquiring DNA from a host planet so that she can eventually bloom, mutating the flora and fauna and terraforming the planet. It absolutely makes sense that there would be some sort of biological pleasure mechanism associated with getting that DNA. Like, there's an evolutionary reason that things feel good. We like sex because it's how we reproduce. Same concept with Saya. Secondly, I highly doubt Saya crafted a replica human vagina, and you really don't need to think too hard about why. Fuminori has been explicitly shown to suffer from hallucinations with all 5 of his senses. Things look gross, voices are distorted, everything stinks, food tastes disgusting, and everything feels squishy and slimy to him. Is it really that much of a stretch to think that when he visually hallucinates a vagina and puts his dick in it, that his brain might just connect the dots and create an appropriate tactile hallucination to go along with it? I mean, come on. The next point is about the reveal of Saya as an eldritch horror. I have some interesting things to say on this point, but let's hear from Ange first.
I know that people hype this visual novel as an eldritch abomination story, but the way the story is written is clearly done as a plot twist where you're not supposed to know what her true form is right away.
I completely disagree. To me, it was glaringly obvious that something was up with Saya from the moment she was introduced. Fuminori is basically living in a desaturated doom level, and he meets one being that looks normal to him, like she's the exception to his brain damage? Don't think so. I think the story was trying to get the reader to ask the question of, what the fuck is she? And the reveal was not a twist, but rather an answer to that question. In fact, I think the actual twist came a bit later. See, the early parts of the story, especially those immediately following that initial reveal of Saya's true nature, were there to obscure her intentions, and mislead the reader into thinking that she was eventually going to turn on him and do whatever horrible things to him she wanted, and that she was really just fucking with him. Which is something she's been shown to enjoy, since she mainly amused herself by scaring the shit out of the patients in the hospital's mental ward. The twist was the reveal that no, Saya actually genuinely cares for Fuminori, that she's not this emotionless, manipulative creature, or at least not in regards to Fuminori. I'm kinda surprised that Ange didn't pick up on that. I thought it was about as subtle as a brick, and Ange is more than smart enough for that in my opinion. Okay, so the next point is about the sexual assault scenes. I couldn't find one section to encompass his entire point here, so I'm gonna play most of it here. It'll be a little over a minute, but it's all important. And I'm gonna preemptively say RIP monetization because I'm like 90% sure this section's gonna get me the $sign of doom.
But I find these rape scenes are just cheap shock value because rape is one of the easiest ways to rile up an audience. However, I think it's exasperated by the couple of points I already mentioned before in my previous reasons. When this random man gets his brain as messed up as Fuminori's, he suddenly gets this bright idea to rape Saya out of insanity. As said earlier, I refuse to believe that a human and their literal mental gymnastics can somehow find a vagina equivalent to rape an eldritch abomination. However, this scene isn't even the worst, because at least this scene can kind of show how Saya herself can eventually become messed up, but more on that later. The actual worst scene is the one where Yo, the character shown to clearly have a crush on Fuminori, gets turned into a tentacle monster herself, which once again somehow gets Fuminori to get some mental gymnastics to somehow find a way to rape this new eldritch version of Yo. What doesn't help is that Saya takes part of this sex, so unlike the original rape scene with just Saya and the random man, which at least had something of plot relevance, this one is just literal cheap shock value just to make the viewer go, oh my god, these two people are so fucked up. This scene alone pretty much killed any forgiveness I would have given the plot at this point.
This point is interesting because while I very much disagree with his argument, and I'll get into why in a bit, I actually tend to agree with his position on the matter, at least in regards to media as a whole. I love my edgy media as much as the next guy. Probably a bit more than the next guy, in fact, but I typically don't care for rape scenes that are edgy for edginess' sake. I'm not against shock value in the slightest, but I do believe that shock value should serve a deliberate purpose, whether that be a serious psychological thing like in Euphoria, or for comedy like in Rants. So I can definitely see why Ange thinks this way, and if we were talking about another piece of media, I might actually agree with him. But I think this point expertly demonstrates that Ange completely missed one of the major themes of Saya No Uta. To be clear, it's not that he picked up on it and didn't like it, which would be completely fair, and knowing Ange, there's a good likelihood that would have been the case, because Saya No Uta just isn't the type of story he tends to like. But regardless, we don't get to really hear that perspective because he missed the point entirely. I've already mentioned this briefly, but the major milestones of this story are marked by Fuminori crossing some sort of line, which then results in a noticeable shift into insanity, irrationality, and degeneracy, with the general tone of the story becoming more grim and dire to reflect that. These two rape scenes showcase two of these milestones, though they happen at very different points, and I would argue that you couldn't have gotten their intended emotional impact without something as vile as rape to stir up that visceral disgust in the reader. I'm going to ignore the biology part of his argument because I already addressed that. But in the first scene, Saya goes to Fuminori's neighbor and warps his mind so that his perceptions are altered in the same way as Fuminori. However, this process drives him insane, and when he sees Saya, his base urges take over and he rapes her until Fuminori kills him. Now side note, Urabuchi was definitely a Lovecraft fan, and there are tons of little nods to his work in Saya No Uta. In particular, I love how pretty much anyone who sees Saya's true form ends up going insane. It's a neat little reference to how many of Lovecraft's monsters make you go insane when you look at them, including Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep, who are arguably the two most famous Lovecraftian horrors. There's so much of this kind of thing in Saya No Uta, and it's one of the reasons I love it so much. That has nothing to do with Ange's point, but I had to say it. Okay, back to the actual topic of the video. So like I was saying before, with each line that Fuminori crosses, it's not actually that big a step. It's a series of individual increments that compound on each other, and at this point in the story, Fuminori hasn't really lost his humanity yet. Like, he's become an asshole to anyone who isn't Saya, but he's still like, alright. When Fuminori sees his neighbor, who still looks like a monster to him by the way, assaulting Saya, who is at this point the one thing he cares about, that's enough to immediately push him over the edge and make him capable of taking his first life, which is a big step even though we can all sympathize with his motivations. And even though his reasons are very understandable, and quite frankly, I would probably do the same thing under similar circumstances, killing someone isn't something you just shrug off, and doing so desensitized him to the idea of killing and further drove that wedge of detachment between him and wider society and pushed him one step closer to his ultimate fall. Now, could the story have achieved a similar result without that rape scene? Yeah, probably. I can imagine an alternate path where Fuminori's neighbor lashes out at Saya with physical violence instead of sexual violence, and with a bit of tweaking to the surrounding scene, I think it could have definitely worked. But I don't think the story has made it all worse for going the path that it did. But I did actually have one problem with the scene. I just can't buy that Fuminori's neighbor is able to physically overpower Saya. While it's true that she isn't anywhere near as physically overbearing as a true Lovecraftian monster, she seems pretty capable all things considered. Even if she couldn't actually overpower him due to his crazy person strength, there's no way she couldn't escape him. So if you watch that last bit of the video and you understand my core point about Saya No Uta being a story of Fuminori going insane step by step, even if you don't agree with me, I think you'll be able to guess where I'm going to say about Ange's opinion on the next scene, where Saya kidnaps Fuminori's now former friend Yo and warps her body into a monstrosity that allows Fuminori to perceive her as her original form. This process completely breaks her mind, and Fuminori and Saya proceed to turn her into their pet/sex slave, and as you might expect, there is a corresponding edgy H scene. Let's go by the staircase structure I've already been talking about. This scene happens pretty deep into the story where Fuminori doesn't really have any more moral lines to cross. The point of this scene is that you take one of the most fucked up things that he could possibly do, and he not only does it, he not only doesn't have any hesitation, he revels in it. He is having the absolute time of his life abusing someone he once cared about. And he doesn't even have his old excuse of visceral, uncontrollable aversion because he no longer views her as a monster. He views her as the person he's always known, and that doesn't even make him skip a beat. This scene is not just, wow, so edgy. The point is to smack you in the face with incontrovertible evidence that Fuminori is fucking gone. The man we were introduced to at the start is dead, and he has no trace of his old sense of morality. Fuminori has completely lost it. They used an extremely graphic and uncomfortable scene to forcibly dispel any potential lingering misconceptions that Fuminori has not become a complete and total monster just like Saya. And I know Ange also takes issue with Saya partaking in this rape scene and basically thinks that her inclusion makes it worse. I disagree, but I'm going to hold off on that for now because I think that a later argument he makes will give a much better opportunity to properly frame my own position. Ange's next point is about the multiple endings Saya No Uta has. I'm not actually going to show you this bit because while I do disagree with some of the things he says in this section of the video, I actually kind of agree with his broader point here. Or at least, I agree that the multi-ending structure was not done particularly well. I think there were some neat ideas here, like I enjoyed how the bad ending was actually the logical good ending with Fuminori being cured and vice versa. I liked how the two main endings each showed a different endpoint to a Lovecraftian protagonist, and yes, both Koji and Ryoko are very much based on typical tropes of a Lovecraftian protagonist, which is one of the things I think is cool about Saya No Uta. But I don't think any of the endings really did enough to justify the existence of multiple endings. Maybe if the VN was overall longer and each section got a bit more love, I might approve, but as is, I think the story should have just been a kinetic story that ended with Saya blooming and mutating the world. My biggest gripe with Ange in this section is that I think he once again puts too much emphasis on Koji being a former friend to Fuminori. I just don't think that idea is as important as he wants to make it. But let's move on. I've already doubled the length of Ange's video as is. Ange's fifth and final point is about how Saya and Fuminori act in ways that hurt his emotional investment in the story. I'm going to be editing a few snippets of this section together just so you know. It doesn't distort his core point at all, but I do again encourage you to watch his video in full so that you can see that I'm not misrepresenting him.
Reason number 5, my hatred of Fuminori and Saya's actions and motivations. I thought anything Fuminori and Saya did basically invalidated any emotional investment I had in their tragic love story. Saya literally preys on people and kills them for the reproduction of her race and ends up feasting on their internal organs. Why should I feel bad about Saya when she's just killing humans for supposedly good reasons for a race we barely know anything about? Fuminori killing the guy who raped Saya makes perfect sense because, well, it's natural to want to kill the person who raped your girlfriend. But everything else he does after? Really stupid. Basically, all the bad stuff that happens is just dumb, cheap, shock value just to excite the audience, and clearly it worked for many people. But for me, all it did was just give me a headache due to how stupid this world is, how little we care about the characters we should supposedly sympathize with, and all that along with the mental gymnastics of the ability of a human penis being able to have sex with a monster eldritch vagina equivalent. This was my first Urobuchi and Nitro Plus experience, and both made a very bad first impression for me.
Okay, so first off, once again, I am ignoring the biology argument. But I think this section of the video really exemplifies why so many people thought it was just rage bait. He makes some incorrect assumptions and just kinda rolls with it, never actually questioning his own perspective on things. And the big one is the idea that you're meant to go through this entire visual novel with the view of Saya and Fuminori are sympathetic characters. Urobuchi does not treat them as people you should approve of. To be fair, Fuminori does start out as a sympathetic character. Sure, he's a bit of an asshole, but you can give him a pass due to the grief, physical trauma, and brain damage that he has to deal with. But as he continues crossing lines and losing his sanity, you're supposed to stop co-signing his shit. This story is primarily one of Fuminori's fall. There comes a point where you stop sympathizing with him because he has become legit evil. That's not a bug, that's a feature. And then there's Saya. If you actually look at the things she says and does from her introduction until either of the main endings, you'll see that she has never been... I hesitate to even categorize her as good versus evil because she kind of operates outside that framework. But we see from the start that she does bad things and has a very clear sadistic streak to her. Before she met Fuminori, she amused herself by traumatizing the mentally ill. She kills people throughout the story, and it's pretty clear that with the exception of Fuminori, she does not view humans as possessing any intrinsic value. They are her food and her playthings. She's like a less sadistic and more playful version of Nyarlathotep. On an objective level, she is not someone to be rooting for, and that's why I disagree that her inclusion in Yo's rape scene was a bad thing for the story. The reason she's typically framed in a positive light is because of something else I suspect Ange missed. Fuminori has essentially had his perception of reality reversed. Things that were good or neutral are seen as bad and vice versa, which is why he sees his friends as monsters, Saya as a cute girl, and human flesh as a tasty snack. And the vast majority of this story is told from Fuminori's perspective, so everything is framed in the way it appears to him, and the story leans on that thematic through line heavily. In fact, the only times the story breaks from that is to reveal things to the audience that Fuminori is not privy to highlight the juxtaposition of Fuminori's perception against reality, or to do both at the same time. Think about every time Saya shows up in a scene that is not from Fuminori's POV. While we never actually see a depiction of her true form, which is a creative decision I actually like a lot, She is framed like a horror villain because that's what she is. She is scary, she is imposing, she is cruel, and she will break you without a second thought. But that's how she is in reality. When Fuminori looks at her, that is not what he sees. He sees his savior, his friend, his sweet innocent companion. And we see this story primarily through his eyes. So yes, his brain filters Saya as this divine being who can do no wrong. But the reader presumably doesn't suffer from the same difficulties with reason and rationality as Fuminori. We share his perspective, but not his madness. So you only have to put the pieces together to see things as they truly are. If you take off the blinders, you see that Saya and Fuminori are the villains of this story. And that is what Saya No Uta was going for, and it's what Ange completely missed. I'm not sure how much he picked up on the flip-flopping reality thing because he just didn't really mention it. But he completely missed the framing of Saya, and I think that likely harmed his overall experience with the visual novel. And that is a shame because I thought it was neat. When Ange first dropped this video, I jokingly said on Twitter, I can't wait to watch this and get angry about it. We've disagreed on stuff before, and we pretty much always end in a place where we see where the other is coming from, but our emotional reactions to things are just different. And that's where I expected we'd be with Saya No Uta, because I'll be the first to tell you that it's not for everyone and there are people who will dislike it, for perfectly valid reasons. And I also had a feeling that Ange probably wouldn't resonate with the Lovecraftian homage as much as I did, and fair enough, his work is a century old and has a very dense writing style that can be a challenge to get through at times. I'm a special breed of autistic. And I probably wouldn't feel nearly as strongly about this story if it weren't for that connection, so again, fair enough. That's actually the root of our disagreement regarding Drakoi. I really resonated with the story's constant homage to classic European fantasy, and he didn't, which caused a massive disconnect. But I was kinda surprised to see so many arguments here that I feel were actively wrong. It really felt like this was a video born of emotion rather than logic. It really did feel like Ange just didn't get it, and ultimately judged it based on what it isn't, rather than judging it based on what it is. And that's kinda shocking to me, because Ange is way more media literate than that. I said this in the beginning of the video, but this isn't a video meant to be just dunking on Ange. I really tried to focus on attacking the argument, not the arguer. I was not lying when I said I genuinely like and respect him, and I know that despite this video, we'll still be cool. And I really do not want you to go out and give him any shit. I will not be happy if I see that. But I felt like his video served as an excellent foundation for me to talk about Saya No Uta in a bit more depth, and to further the ongoing discussions about the media we love. Or hate, as the case may be. I think these kinds of back and forth pseudo debates are fun and interesting, and I ultimately want positive things from this video. I want you in the audience to really think and engage with stories and appreciate the little things that go into them. And don't just blindly agree with me. Use my thoughts as a way to fuel your own desire to think about these things for yourself. Make your own observations and really try to hammer home why you think the way you do. And if you do that and disagree with me or have some sort of alternative perspective, please do share. My favorite comments are the ones where people actively engage with the topics on my videos. It means I'm doing something right. Ange, I know you're watching this video, and I know you'd have watched it even if I didn't let you know about it ahead of time. I've said it like 3 times by now, but from my perspective, we're still cool and we were never anything but. And I know that you will almost certainly take this in the friendly spirit with which it was intended. I said this to you on Twitter, and I meant it. I still love you, even when you're wrong. Thanks for watching. I know this was outside my normal style of content, but I was inspired. Quick announcement, I've discontinued my Patreon and everything has moved over to YouTube memberships, and all members of all tiers will receive early access. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please do check it out. And of course, likes and subscriptions are also greatly appreciated, and feel free to chime in on the discussion in the comments below. Rant 6 video is in the works as we speak. No ETA just yet, but I'm working on it. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back.